Copyright 2014 Math Diagnostics and Intervention, all rights reserved. We're going to take a look at how to add signed numbers. And the first thing we want to look at is what does it really mean when we take 3 and add it to 4? Well, what we have in pictures is we have 3 positives and we're going to add it to 4 more positives. And the question is, how many positives do we have altogether? Well, we have 3 positives and 4 more positives. Altogether, that's 7 positives. And we just quickly think of it as 3 plus 4. Oh, that's 7. Now, this is fine when we're just dealing with positives, but what happens when we start dealing with negative numbers? Let's take a look at what happens when we have a problem like -2 plus -3. What's happening this time is we have 2 negative numbers and we're going to add it to 3 negatives. And the question becomes, how many negatives do we have altogether? Well, we have 2 negatives here and 2 negatives there. That gives us a total of 5 negatives. And that's what we do with our signed number. -2 plus -3 is -5. The question becomes, what happens when we start adding positives and negatives together? Let's take a look at what happens when we have 2 and we want to add -3 to 2. Well, what's happening this time is we have 2 positives and 3 negatives, and we want to add them together. But as we know, 1 positive and 1 negative is equal to 0. So that positive and that negative add up to 0. And this positive and this negative add up to 0. What do we have left over? A -1. We just have 1 negative left when we're done with this. And the question we ask when we're adding signed numbers is, who has more? Do the positives have more or do the negatives have more? Well, the negatives have a larger magnitude. There are more negatives than there are positives. So the negatives wipe out all of the positives and we just have 1 negative left over. So 2 plus -3 becomes -1. We could also end up with something like -4 plus 6. Now let's take a look at what is happening with this in the form of pictures. We have 4 negatives and we have 6 positives. And the question becomes, what happens when we combine these two? Well, again, our negatives and our positives wipe each other out on a 1-for-1 basis. So this negative and one of the positives get wiped out, and another negative and another positive. And we're just going to keep matching up these positives and negatives until we run out of one or the other. And in this case, we ran out of negatives. There are no more negatives to match up with the 2 positives that we have left over. Those positive and negative pairs are just 0. So we end up with 2 positives when we're done. Again, we ask, in our problem over here, we ask the question, which has more? Do we have more positives or do we have more negatives? In this case, we have more positives. How many more positives are there? There are 2 more positives. And the rules don't change just because the numbers get larger. If we look at -14 and we're going to add 21 to it. I could draw the pictures over here of 14 negatives and 21 positives, but let's just take a look at who has more. Are there more positives or are there more negatives? In this case, there are more positives. 21 positives and only 14 negatives. So those 14 negatives wipe out 14 of my positives. So we have 7 left over. One more time, if we have negative 18 plus 12, who has more? Are there more positives or are there more negatives? Well, in this case, there are more negatives. Negative 18, there are 18 negatives and only 12 positives. So my negatives wipe out all of my positives, and I have 6 negatives left over. And we can also do one more problem. If I have negative 7 plus 7. Well, in this case, the positives and the negatives have the same number of members. They wipe each other out completely. And what do we have left over when we wipe out each other completely, when the positives and the negatives are all gone? We have 0. So if you remember to ask who wins and by how much, you should be okay with this. If I have two negatives, negative 3 plus negative 8, there are no positives to wipe out the negatives. That's just negative 11. If I have 4 plus 9, there are no negatives to wipe out the positives. That's just 13. When I have one of each, if I have negative 4 plus 9, well, my negatives get wiped out completely, and I still have 5 positives left over. So negative 4 plus 9 is 5. And if I have 12 plus negative 17, my positives get wiped out by my 17 negatives, and I have negative 5 left over. Keep remembering to ask who wins and by how much, and you should have very little difficulty adding signed numbers. Good luck.